Okay, so now you're talking about that the ego is actually something dangerous if you completely solely operate ego-based. So what about not operating, trying not to have an ego or trying to work around the ego? Is that the solution?
Well, you see, that's the essence of it is that the ego has to realize that there is more than the ego in the house, and that there must be a kind of an let's call it an inner democracy. Other aspects of the self also have a voice in the self. You see, the shadow is just another voice that is trying to tell the ego you're not the only one that is living in this house. The problem with abandoning the ego is that we don't kill the ego. The ego has to learn to form an alliance with the shadow, with the other aspects in the self, other members of the family of the self, and then surrender via doing that to a higher center in the self, which is the self with the capital S, which is the master within. So for instance, the ego, when someone would say that I cured my cancers, actually one should say the cancer is here to cure me. The self is trying to cure the ego, but not kill the ego. When the ego surrenders to the self, the higher power, the ego is surrendering to a higher level in the self, which does have a multidimensional awareness, while the ego is locked into that box of 3 dimensions. So the surrender of the ego to not the higher power within inevitably leads to surrendering to some external power, which is, one could say, a kind of a formula for cults and sects. You see, so the ego is very necessary to take us to the self, and not to extinguish the ego. And then what? Who is going to then direct the person? You see? And that's very, very fundamental.
It still has to be you. You have to keep ruling.
Yes. Because, yes, you have to...
But not more on a field-based awareness instead of a
yes, because the real individual, which is the self, does not conceive of itself as separate. You see? That's the only...
Right, because the outside the field keeps talking.
Yes. And ever more so. But the self, the real individual, doesn't experience itself as loose from the river. The Tao, the great flow, it's, you see, then we get that the real self is a fractal of the whole, not a part. It's a whole of a whole. And that's a major point in...
What do you mean by that?
Well, if you don't see this, then you end up juxtaposing the individual against the collective. And then you just get a kind of a ego extinction and towards a kind of a socialism where the collective then becomes the center of control. But within this understanding, when we integrate the ego with the other parts of the self, through which a whole self is birthed, then that self does not see itself as separate from the whole. It's then a fractal, then it's a little whole.
How is that different from socialism?
Because then the center of control is not so external to the individual. You see, this is extremely important, because we have made this whole journey of consciousness to give birth to the self. There is a transformation happening on this planet that seemingly hasn't happened anywhere ever before. And that is the birth of a self-aware planet. A system that is self-aware of itself, which has nothing to do with individualism and egoism. It has to do with a higher level of consciousness of the whole system, that is based on a system that is self-conscious. You see, before there is self-awareness, a system cannot correct itself. You see, but this is extremely important, that we realize that there is that the ego surrenders itself, a self-sacrifice, but not towards the death of the ego, but towards a transformation of the ego and the other parts of the self towards a higher center, which